Paraguay is unlike any other country in South America. Beneath its rolling landscapes and deep forests lies a genetic mystery shaped by survival, war, and an unbreakable connection to the past. Its DNA tells a story of lost civilizations, European conquest, and a war so devastating that it changed the country's bloodline forever. What if a single war could erase the genetic identity of a nation? What if an entire country had to rebuild its population by importing foreign blood? This is the story hidden inside the DNA of Paraguayans, a story few know, but one that has shaped an entire nation. Long before the Spanish arrived, the land we now call Paraguay was home to the Guarani. They were warriors, farmers, and navigators, living along the rivers that cut through the heart of South America. But there was something different about them. While other civilizations built vast cities, the Guarani remained semi-nomadic, deeply connected to nature. Their isolation preserved their genetic heritage, locking in a unique lineage that would eventually be tested by time and conquest. Then the Spanish arrived. The 16th century marked the beginning of a new era, one that would forever alter the genetic makeup of Paraguay. Unlike in many other colonies, Spanish men did not bring their wives with them. Instead, they took Guarani women as partners, blending European and native bloodlines at an unprecedented rate. This was not a slow process. It happened rapidly. Within just a few generations, Paraguay became a land of mestizos, where native mothers passed down ancient Guarani DNA, but European fathers dominated the Y chromosome lineage. The result? A genetic landscape unlike any other in the region, where native ancestry survived through women, but European genes took over the male lineage. But Paraguay's true genetic turning point came in the late 19th century, during the bloodiest conflict in Latin American history, the War of the Triple Alliance. The war was catastrophic. Paraguay fought against Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay in a brutal conflict that lasted 6 years. By the time it was over, more than half of the Paraguayan population was gone. The loss was not just in numbers, it was in the structure of society itself. Almost all adult men had perished, leaving behind a country where women and children were the only survivors. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a complete genetic reset. With an entire generation of Paraguayan men wiped out, the country had only one option: repopulation. The government launched a desperate immigration campaign, inviting Europeans from Italy, Germany, and Spain to settle in Paraguay. Thousands of men arrived, marrying local women and reshaping the nation's genetic future once again. Over time, the Paraguayan Y chromosome became overwhelmingly European, while the maternal lineage remained deeply Native American. It is one of the most extreme cases of sex-biased genetic inheritance in the world. But Paraguay's genetic evolution didn't stop there. Throughout the 20th century, more waves of immigrants arrived: Japanese, Koreans, Mennonite Germans, and even Brazilian farmers known as Brassiguelos. Each group left its own mark, adding new layers to Paraguay's complex DNA map. Yet despite these changes, one thing remained: the Guarani language. More than 90% of Paraguayans still speak it today, a living testament to their indigenous ancestry, even as their genes tell a different story. Paraguay's DNA holds a history of survival, adaptation, and transformation. A nation nearly erased by war, rebuilt by foreign blood, yet still carrying the genetic echoes of its past. Its people are the descendants of warriors, settlers, and survivors, a population shaped by forces beyond their control. But what does the future hold for Paraguay's genetic identity? With declining birth rates and continued migration, will this unique genetic blend remain, or will it shift once again? For thousands of years, the land that is now Paraguay was home to the Guarani people. They thrived in the forests and rivers, building a way of life deeply connected to nature. Unlike the great empires of the Inca or Aztecs, the Guarani did not construct massive cities or towering temples. Instead, they lived in scattered villages, relying on their knowledge of the land. But while their civilization may have seemed simple, their genetic lineage was anything but. It carried the story of migration stretching back thousands of years, long before European ships appeared on the horizon. The Guarani were not a single unified people. Some groups were settled agriculturalists, while others remained nomadic, moving through the vast forests of South America. This division would later shape the genetic makeup of Paraguayans. The Guarani, who lived along the eastern rivers, cultivated crops, creating communities that remained relatively stable. Their DNA, passed down through generations, became deeply rooted in the region. Meanwhile, the more nomadic groups of the western Chaco moved frequently, making their genetic contributions to the population less permanent. But everything changed with the arrival of the Spanish in the early 1500s. Unlike in other parts of South America, the Spanish did not conquer Paraguay through brute force. Instead, they formed alliances with the Guarani, integrating themselves into native society. This cooperation was not purely strategic. It was also biological. Spanish men married Guarani women, and their children became the first generation of mestizos. This mixing of genes happened so quickly that within just a few generations, pure Spanish or pure Guarani bloodlines became rare. Yet, despite this genetic blending, something remarkable happened. The Guarani language survived. Even as Spanish culture took root, the native tongue persisted. Today, over 90% of Paraguayans still speak Guarani, making it one of the few indigenous languages in the world that remains widely spoken in a majority mestizo country. This linguistic survival is a mystery of its own. Why did the language endure, even as genetic ancestry shifted so dramatically? Some believe it was due to the isolation of Paraguay from the rest of the Spanish Empire, while others argue that the deep spiritual connection between the Guarani and their language made it impossible to erase. But genes tell a different story. DNA studies reveal that while the Guarani language remained, their male genetic lineages almost disappeared. The Y chromosome data shows that the vast majority of Paraguayan men today carry European ancestry. This means that over centuries, the original Guarani male lineages were gradually replaced. The reason? A combination of war, forced labor, and a society where European men held power. Over time, the genetic contribution of Guarani men faded, while their language and cultural influence remained strong. The survival of the Guarani identity in Paraguay is unlike anything seen in other South American countries. In places like Argentina and Chile, native languages nearly vanished as European influence grew. But in Paraguay, something different happened. Even as European genes dominated the male lineage, the Guarani language and cultural traditions remained woven into daily life. Today, Paraguay stands as a country where indigenous heritage is preserved, not through bloodlines alone, but through the very way people speak, think, and see the world. Paraguay's genetic history is not just a story of survival, it's a story of transformation. The Guarani may have lost their dominance in the gene pool, but their legacy remains unbreakable. And as we continue to uncover more about Paraguay's DNA, one question lingers. How much of who we are is determined by our genes, and how much is shaped by the culture we carry forward? When the Spanish arrived in Paraguay in the 16th century, they found a land untouched by European influence. Unlike the gold-rich colonies of Peru and Mexico, Paraguay had no vast mineral wealth, no grand cities to conquer. But what it did have was something far more valuable to the Spanish settlers: land, rivers, and a native population willing to form alliances. Unlike in other parts of South America, the Spanish conquest of Paraguay was not a campaign of destruction. It was a slow process of integration, one that would forever alter the genetic makeup of its people. The early Spanish settlers were almost entirely men. They arrived without families, without European women, and soon, they began taking Guarani wives. This was not an isolated practice. It became the foundation of Paraguayan society. While other South American colonies maintained a rigid racial hierarchy, Paraguay was different. Here, intermarriage was not only accepted but encouraged. This unique social structure led to one of the fastest rates of genetic mixing in the entire continent. Within just a few generations, a new identity had emerged: the mestizo, a population with both European and Native American ancestry. But this was not an equal blending. Genetic studies today reveal a stark imbalance. While most Paraguayans carry Guarani DNA from their maternal lineage, their paternal ancestry is overwhelmingly European. This means that while Guarani women passed their genes down through generations, Guarani men were gradually replaced. The reason? The structure of colonial society. Spanish settlers controlled land, wealth, and power, while indigenous men were pushed into forced labor or military service. Over time, fewer and fewer Guarani male lineages remained. At the same time, Paraguay's relative isolation from the rest of the Spanish Empire allowed its unique genetic structure to develop uninterrupted. Unlike Argentina or Brazil, which saw waves of immigration from all over Europe, Paraguay remained a closed system for much of its early history. The result? A population that, even today, carries a higher percentage of indigenous ancestry than many of its neighbors. But the Spanish influence on Paraguay's DNA was not just about bloodlines. It was also about survival. The Spanish introduced new agricultural techniques, domesticated animals, and, most importantly, immunity to European diseases. In the decades following contact, smallpox, measles, and other foreign illnesses devastated indigenous populations across the Americas. Yet, in Paraguay, the rapid intermarriage between Spaniards and Guarani may have provided a genetic advantage. The mestizo population, carrying both native and European immune system adaptations, was better equipped to withstand these new threats. By the time Paraguay declared independence in 1811, its population was already genetically distinct from other South American nations. It was neither fully European nor fully indigenous. It was something entirely new. A nation built on intermarriage, on cultural fusion, and on a genetic legacy that still defines its people today. But how much of this history is still visible in modern Paraguayans? Do their genes still carry the traces of those first Spanish-Guarani unions? And as the country continues to evolve, will this unique genetic identity remain? Or will new waves of migration reshape it once again? In 1864, Paraguay was a rising power in South America. It was economically self-sufficient, politically stable, and had a growing population. But within just 6 years, everything changed. The War of the Triple Alliance, fought against Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, was the most devastating conflict in Latin American history. By the time it ended in 1870, Paraguay was nearly wiped off the map. More than half of its total population was dead, and an estimated 90% of its adult male population was gone. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a complete demographic collapse, one that reshaped the country's genetic future forever. With an entire generation of men lost, Paraguay faced an unimaginable crisis. The war had left behind a population made up mostly of women and children. Families were destroyed, communities were abandoned, and the very fabric of society was torn apart. But the most lasting impact wasn't just economic or political, it was genetic. The sudden loss of Paraguayan men meant that the country's gene pool was permanently altered. Entire male bloodlines vanished, leaving behind a population where the Y chromosome lineage was nearly erased. In the aftermath of the war, the Paraguayan government had only one solution: repopulation. Desperate to rebuild, they launched a campaign to attract European immigrants, offering land and incentives to settlers from Italy, Germany, Spain, and France. Thousands arrived, bringing with them a new genetic influence that would reshape Paraguay for generations to come. But because most of these immigrants were men, they married local Paraguayan women, women who still carried the deep maternal ancestry of the indigenous Guarani. The result was a genetic transformation unlike anything seen before. Within just a few decades, Paraguay's Y-DNA, passed down from father to son, became overwhelmingly European, while the mitochondrial DNA, inherited from mothers, remained predominantly Native American. This massive imbalance created one of the most extreme cases of sex-biased ancestry in the world. The Paraguayan male lineage, once deeply indigenous, was now largely of European origin. But there was another unexpected consequence of this genetic shift. The newcomers brought not just their DNA, but their culture, their traditions, and their languages. German Mennonites settled in the Chaco region, creating isolated communities that remained genetically distinct. Italians and Spaniards integrated more quickly, blending into the Paraguayan population, but leaving behind linguistic and cultural influences that still persist today. And with each new generation, Paraguay's identity continued to evolve, a nation rebuilt from the ashes of war, shaped by the survival of those who remained and the arrival of those who came after. Yet, despite these dramatic changes, something remarkable happened. The Guarani influence never disappeared. Even as Paraguay's male genetic lineages became more European, the indigenous language and cultural traditions remained strong. Unlike in other South American countries, where European immigration led to the decline of native identities, Paraguay held onto its roots. The genetics changed, but the cultural foundation remained. Today, Paraguay's DNA still carries the scars of the war. The loss of an entire generation of men is imprinted in its genetic structure, a silent reminder of the country's darkest chapter. But it also tells a story of resilience, how a nation on the brink of extinction found a way to survive, rebuild, and create a new identity from the fragments of its past. But this raises an even bigger question. If a single war could so drastically reshape a nation's genetic identity, what other untold histories are hidden in the DNA of the world? Could modern genetics unlock forgotten stories of survival, migration, and transformation? Paraguay's modern population is the result of centuries of migration, survival, and adaptation. But if we could break it down, gene by gene, what would we find? What does the DNA of the average Paraguayan actually look like? Unlike many of its South American neighbors, Paraguay's genetic makeup tells a story of extreme contrasts. While its cultural identity remains deeply connected to its indigenous Guarani roots, the genetic evidence paints a more complex picture, one of displacement, reconstruction, and hidden ancestry waiting to be uncovered. DNA studies reveal that Paraguayans are among the most genetically homogeneous populations in South America, yet their ancestry is anything but simple. The maternal lineage, passed through mitochondrial DNA, remains overwhelmingly Native American. This means that for centuries, Paraguayan women have carried forward the genetic legacy of the Guarani, despite waves of European migration. But when we examine the paternal lineage, traced through the Y chromosome, the story is entirely different. More than 90% of Paraguayan men today carry European ancestry, primarily from Spain and Italy. This is one of the highest levels of European Y DNA found in the region, despite the country's strong indigenous heritage. So how did this happen? The answer lies in Paraguay's history of extreme population shifts. The rapid Spanish-Guarani intermarriage in the early colonial period meant that European men, not women, passed their genes forward while native women ensured the survival of their own bloodlines. Later, the War of the Triple Alliance nearly erased Paraguay's original male ancestry, forcing the country to rely on European immigrants to rebuild its population. This replacement of indigenous Y DNA with European lineages created a population where genetic heritage and cultural identity took vastly different paths. But European ancestry in Paraguay is not limited to the Spanish. In the 20th century, Paraguay became home to thousands of Germans, Ukrainians, Russians, and even Japanese settlers. While their genetic impact on the broader population is smaller, their influence remains strong in certain regions. The Mennonite communities of the Chaco are one of the most distinct genetic groups in Paraguay, maintaining their European bloodlines for generations due to isolation and endogamy. Meanwhile, Japanese and Korean settlers in cities like Ciudad del Este have contributed small but noticeable genetic markers to Paraguay's DNA landscape. There's also another layer to Paraguay's ancestry that often goes unnoticed: African heritage. Unlike Brazil or Colombia, Paraguay did not receive large numbers of enslaved Africans during the colonial period. However, studies estimate that around 4% of Paraguayans have African ancestry, mostly due to historical migrations and mixing with neighboring populations. While this percentage is small, it remains a testament to the country's diverse and often overlooked past. But perhaps the most surprising discovery in Paraguayan DNA is its genetic link to other indigenous groups across South America. Certain rare mitochondrial haplogroups found in Paraguayans are also present in native populations of Brazil, Argentina, and even the Andes. This suggests that ancient migration patterns may have connected these regions long before European contact. Could this mean that the Guarani were part of a much larger network of indigenous civilizations? As science advances, DNA analysis continues to reveal more about Paraguay's hidden ancestry. Every gene carries a piece of history, and every mutation is a clue to the past. While Paraguayans today may identify culturally as mestizo, their genetic story is far more intricate, woven together by centuries of conquest, migration, and survival. But with rising migration and a declining birth rate, how will Paraguay's DNA change in the future? Will the genetic signature of the Guarani endure, or will new waves of immigration once again rewrite the country's ancestry? The answers may lie in the very DNA of the next generation. Paraguay's genetic history is filled with unexpected twists, but one of the most fascinating aspects is how entire communities of foreign settlers helped reshape the nation's DNA. While Spanish and Italian influences dominate, Paraguay's genetic landscape is far more diverse than most people realize. Scattered across the country are isolated groups, some thriving in remote regions, others blending into the general population, each leaving behind a unique genetic imprint. One of the most distinct genetic enclaves in Paraguay is found deep in the Chaco, where German Mennonites have maintained their heritage for nearly a century. Arriving in the 1920s and 30s from Canada, Russia, and Germany, these settlers established self-sufficient colonies, separated from the rest of the country. Unlike most of Paraguay, where European paternal ancestry mixed with native maternal lineage, the Mennonites kept their bloodlines almost entirely European. Even today, their genetic markers show a closer relationship to Northern and Central Europe than to the rest of South America. But despite their genetic isolation, their impact on Paraguay's economy and agriculture has been enormous, proving that ancestry is not just about DNA. It's about the way communities shape the land around them. In the eastern part of Paraguay, near the bustling trade hub of Ciudad del Este, a very different group of immigrants arrived in the 20th century, the Japanese and Koreans. Unlike the Mennonites, these settlers integrated into Paraguayan society, but maintained elements of their cultural and genetic identity. DNA analysis has revealed traces of East Asian ancestry in Paraguayans, though at much lower levels than European or Native American genes. The question remains, how much of this ancestry will persist as these communities continue to intermarry with the local population? Will their genetic legacy remain, or will it eventually blend into the broader mestizo identity? There's also a hidden Middle Eastern influence in Paraguay's DNA. Lebanese, Syrian, and Palestinian immigrants have been arriving since the late 19th century, establishing businesses and integrating into society. Though their genetic footprint is smaller, it remains a unique part of Paraguay's diversity. The presence of Middle Eastern Y chromosome haplogroups suggests that some paternal lineages from this region have been passed down through generations. But perhaps the most controversial and least understood part of Paraguay's genetic history is its connection to Argentina and Brazil. The Brasileiros, a term used to describe Brazilian immigrants in Paraguay, have had a massive demographic impact in the border regions. These settlers, mainly of Portuguese and mixed European descent, introduced new genetic influences that continue to shape Paraguay today. Some researchers argue that the constant movement of people between Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina has created a regional genetic melting pot, where borders are political but ancestry is fluid. What makes Paraguay's DNA so intriguing is not just the variety of influences, but the way different communities have preserved or lost their original genetic traits. Some groups, like the Mennonites, have resisted mixing with the broader population, while others, like the Italian and Spanish immigrants, blended in almost immediately. This raises an important question. What determines whether a genetic legacy endures or disappears? Is it isolation, cultural preservation, or simply time? As Paraguay continues to evolve, its genetic makeup is also shifting. New migration patterns, changing birth rates, and globalization are shaping the DNA of future generations. The communities that once stood apart may eventually merge into the greater Paraguayan identity, or they may persist as living genetic archives of the country's complex past. One thing is certain, Paraguay's DNA is not just a record of history, but a glimpse into the forces that continue to shape its people. Paraguay's genetic story is not just about its past, it's still unfolding. The way its population has changed over the last century is unlike any other country in South America. While other nations experienced mass immigration from Europe, Asia, and Africa, Paraguay remained relatively isolated for much of its history. But in recent decades, its demographic structure has been shifting in unexpected ways. Birth rates have declined, migration patterns have changed, and new influences are beginning to reshape the nation's DNA. The question now is, What does the future of Paraguayan genetics look like? One of the most significant changes happening in Paraguay today is the declining birth rate. For most of its history, Paraguay had one of the highest fertility rates in South America. Families were large, and population growth was steady. But in the last few decades, that has changed dramatically. The average number of children per woman has dropped from over 4 in 1990 to just 1.95 today, a number barely above replacement level. This means that Paraguay's population is growing at a much slower rate than before, and if this trend continues, it could eventually start to shrink. At the same time, migration trends are changing the genetic landscape. Historically, Paraguayans emigrated to countries like Argentina, Spain, and the United States in search of better opportunities. But now, Paraguay is becoming a destination for migrants rather than just a source. Thousands of Brazilians, Argentinians, and even Venezuelans have settled in Paraguay in recent years, bringing new genetic diversity into the population. The Brasileiros, Brazilians who have settled along the border, continue to grow in numbers, blending into Paraguayan society while also maintaining connections to their Brazilian roots. Another factor reshaping Paraguay's DNA is the increasing urbanization of the country. For most of its history, Paraguay was a rural nation, with most of its population living in small towns and villages. But today, more than 60% of Paraguayans live in urban areas, with the capital, Asunción, growing rapidly. Urbanization often leads to greater genetic mixing, as people from different backgrounds interact and start families. This could mean that some of the genetic distinctions seen in more isolated regions of the country, such as the Mennonite communities of the Chaco, might begin to fade over time. But despite these changes, one thing remains consistent: the survival of the Guarani genetic lineage. While the country's paternal ancestry continues to show strong European influence, maternal Native American ancestry has remained largely intact. Even as Paraguay's population evolves, its deep indigenous roots are still present in the DNA of nearly every citizen. Yet, the biggest mystery of Paraguay's genetic future is how global influences will shape the next generations. As international trade, digital communication, and cross-border relationships increase, will Paraguay's unique genetic structure remain distinct? Or will it become part of a larger South American melting pot, blending further with its neighbors? One thing is certain: DNA does not lie. It holds the history of where we came from and offers a glimpse into where we're headed. Paraguay's genetics tell a story of survival, adaptation, and transformation, and as the country moves forward, its DNA will continue to evolve, just as it has for centuries. Paraguay's genetic history is filled with migration, conflict, and adaptation, but some of its most fascinating secrets are hidden deep within its DNA. While most studies focus on the broad strokes, Spanish colonization, European immigration, and indigenous ancestry, there are lesser-known genetic markers that reveal surprising connections to distant civilizations and ancient migrations. These hidden traces in Paraguayan DNA suggest that the country's ancestry is far more complex than history books tell us. One of the most intriguing discoveries in recent genetic research is the presence of rare mitochondrial DNA haplogroups that don't match the typical Native American, European, or African ancestry expected in Paraguay. Some of these markers link Paraguayans to ancient indigenous groups in the Amazon, suggesting prehistoric migrations that connected Paraguay to regions far beyond its modern borders. Others show similarities to populations in the Andean highlands, hinting at possible trade routes or intertribal movement long before the Spanish arrived. But the surprises don't stop there. Certain Y chromosome markers found in Paraguay suggest limited but detectable influence from non-Iberian European groups, including lineages typically associated with the Balkans and Central Europe. These markers may be remnants of small waves of migration from regions like Hungary, Poland, or even the Ottoman Empire, carried by settlers who integrated into Paraguayan society over generations. While these influences are minor compared to the dominant Spanish and Italian ancestry, their presence is a reminder that history is never as simple as it seems. Another unexpected twist in Paraguay's genetic makeup is the presence of Middle Eastern and Jewish ancestry. While small in percentage, genetic studies have found traces of Sephardic Jewish lineage among some Paraguayans, likely a result of migration from Spain, During the colonial period, many Jewish families, fleeing persecution from the Spanish Inquisition, settled in Latin America under false identities. Over time, their descendants blended into the general population, leaving behind only faint genetic echoes of their origins. Yet, perhaps the most mysterious aspect of Paraguayan DNA is the potential link to ancient Pacific migrations. Some genetic markers found in South America resemble those seen in certain Polynesian and Southeast Asian populations. While this connection is still debated among scientists, some researchers believe it could suggest pre-Columbian contact between South American indigenous groups and Pacific Islanders, possibly through long-distance sea travel. Could Paraguay's ancestors have been part of one of the most remarkable migrations in human history? These hidden stories in Paraguay's DNA challenge conventional history. They suggest that Paraguay's ancestors were not just passive recipients of colonization, but were part of larger, more complex movements of people across continents. While much of Paraguay's genetic heritage is well documented, there is still so much left to uncover. Secrets buried in the very cells of its people, waiting to be revealed. As genetic science advances, we may soon unlock even more unexpected connections, proving once again that our history is not written in stone, but in the ever-changing code of our DNA. Paraguay's DNA holds the key to a story still being written, a story shaped not just by the past, but by what's to come. While history has left its mark on the country's genetic landscape, the forces of modern science, migration, and cultural change are actively shaping the future of Paraguayan ancestry. What will the genetic profile of Paraguayans look like in 50 or even 100 years? Will the distinct blend of Native American and European ancestry remain? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a new transformation? One of the biggest factors influencing Paraguay's genetic future is globalization. Advances in technology and transportation have made it easier than ever for people to move across borders, and Paraguay is no exception. In recent years, a growing number of Paraguayans have left the country for Argentina, Spain, and the United States, seeking better economic opportunities. At the same time, Paraguay has seen an influx of migrants from Venezuela, Brazil, and East Asia. This constant movement of people means that Paraguay's once isolated gene pool is becoming more connected to the broader global population. Another major shift is urbanization. For centuries, Paraguay's population was mostly rural, with communities staying in the same region for generations. But today, more Paraguayans are moving to cities like Asunción, Encarnación, and Ciudad del Este, where they encounter people from different backgrounds. In urban areas, intermarriage between ethnic groups is more common, leading to a gradual blending of genetic lineages that were once more distinct. Over time, this could lead to the dilution of genetic markers that were once unique to certain populations, such as the Mennonites in the Chaco or the Japanese communities in the East. Science is also playing a role in shaping Paraguay's genetic future. With the rise of DNA testing and ancestry research, more Paraguayans are learning about their heritage in ways previous generations never could. As genetic studies become more widespread, Paraguayans may start to embrace a more complex understanding of their ancestry, recognizing influences from unexpected sources. This could lead to a cultural shift where identity is shaped not just by history and tradition, but by scientific discovery. Yet, even as new influences enter Paraguay's gene pool, there are elements of its ancestry that seem unshakable. The deep maternal lineage of the Guarani, present in the DNA of most Paraguayans, has endured despite centuries of European migration. Even with modern demographic shifts, this Native American genetic legacy is likely to persist for generations. The real question is, what does all of this mean for the identity of future Paraguayans? Will they still see themselves as mestizo? Or will new terms emerge to reflect the evolving genetic reality? As the world becomes more interconnected, will Paraguay's distinct ancestry become part of a larger South American genetic pattern? Or will it retain its unique blend? One thing is certain, genetics is not just about the past. It is a living, evolving force, shaping who we are and who we will become. Paraguay's DNA is not a fixed story, but a dynamic one, continuing to change with every generation. And as science uncovers more about where Paraguayans came from, it may also give clues about where they are headed next.